have to come to young people's and we'll show you. I want to begin this morning by reading a passage from the New Testament. Just one verse that really, I believe, is foundational to all that I'm going to say today and, Lord willing, in the next 2 or 3 weeks from the book of Proverbs. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 14 says, and this is Paul's words to us as believers, "Now we exhort you, brethren, first of all, warn them that are unruly. Number 2, encourage the faint-hearted. Number 3, support the weak. And number 4, be patient toward all men." This verse has been going through my mind very frequently for, I would say, 2 or 3 months. In my own analysis and evaluation of other believers I know, the problems they go through, the victories that I see in people's lives, when we get to know one another and our problems on a personal level, we always have to ask ourselves, well, what am I going to do about this? And I think that we have wrapped up in this little verse phenomenal truth that should be appropriated by every one of us who are God's people here this morning. The more you get to know one another, the more we see of one another's problems. I know your problems pretty good. We all know one another's problems if we have any kind of a relationship whatsoever. But this verse holds the kernels of truth as to how to help one another, how to overcome problems, how to live with one another in harmony in the local church. And if every one of us take home this morning this truth, you can forget about what I say in the message this morning, because I don't want you to forget about what I have to say, but if you were to forget everything I said in the message this morning and take home the significant truths of 1 Thessalonians 5:14, that's in a nutshell the application, we'd all be much better off. Do you know Christians that have been walking contrary to the Word of God? The solution for that problem is to warn them. Do you know Christians that are weak and faint-hearted and discouraged and upset and really having a battle? Do you know Christians like that? Encourage them and support them. Do you know Christians that are like a yo-yo in their Christian experience? Up and down, up and down. Sometimes on top. Next time you see them, they're walking away from the Lord. What do you do with people like that? What do you do with yourself? Don't talk about other people. Talk about yourselves. I'm a preacher, and I know the battle that I fight day by day, like a yo-yo, up and down, in God's will, out of God's will, in fellowship, walking in darkness. What do you do with people like us? Be patient toward all men. In the next 2 or 3 weeks, in the Lord's will, I want to continue and to conclude our study in the book of Proverbs by looking at relationships. In the book of Proverbs so far, we've gone through the first 8 chapters in some detail, doing an exposition of the book. Kind of went section by section and looked at the topics as they came along. In the middle section of the book of Proverbs, which we spent about a month and a half on, we have focused on various topics that Solomon kind of hits and misses time and time and time again. The subjects come up, and we've really focused on those things as looking specifically at character qualities and virtues that we need to develop in our lives. And these next 4 weeks, I think really it would be disastrous to leave the book of Proverbs without looking at relationships, because Solomon is giving advice to his young son about people, really. Life and teaching, teaching from the pulpit is essentially impractical and of no value if it doesn't touch on relationships, because we're all people. And everything we do focuses on my relationship to either God or to my spouse or to my brothers and sisters in the family, to my children, to people at work, to unsaved people that scoff and ridicule me for my faith, and to anyone else, to any other people types. And the book of Proverbs is just jam-packed with description of people types. And it's a good thing that we're all different this morning, because we can all identify with different people types. So this morning I want to look at husband-wife relationships. Next week I want to focus in on parent-child relationships. We may spend 1 week looking at man-woman relationships in general. I'm not sure about that. And I think maybe we'll spend a week looking at types of people. I haven't really narrowed that one down. So let's turn to the book of Proverbs, and we'll go to the first chapter and the 8th verse to start out with this morning. We're talking about marriage, as Solomon, the wisest man, saw it. It does us well to remember that Solomon was the son of David. David was, at one and the same time in the Scriptures, stands out even today as the greatest, one of the greatest of God's people, one of the greatest of the saints, certainly the greatest king of Israel, and at the same time one of the greatest of sinners. And Solomon grew up watching his father. He learned from him. He learned the good things and the bad things. Solomon became a spiritual giant by watching his father. And he looked at his father's sins, and he became one of the greatest sinners himself. Solomon miserably failed in marriage, and yet he was led by the Spirit of God to record for us this book, which God has inspired for our admonition and teaching. For some of us this morning, as I said a few moments ago, it ought to be a slap in the face. It ought to warn us. It ought to check us. And it ought to be like a bit in a horse's mouth and pull back and make us fall over dead almost in pain and sorrow for our sins. On the other hand, this book is precious and helpful and protective for those of you who are not yet married. Everybody needs to go into marriage with their eyes open. If anything needs to be said, people need to get married with their eyes open. It's not something you take lightly. You need to be prepared for that, if for anything. And this book will do that. For those of you who are struggling, and I don't think that there is a married couple in existence that is not struggling in some area or areas. For people in that situation, for all of us, this book is likewise at the same time. For us, it is an encouragement. It's a stimulator. It makes us think. It reminds us. It upholds us. And it will also, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, this book will also help you to be patient. It'll help you see that life never ends at the end of an episode in our lives. We continue on and on and on. We learn. We should learn, at least, from our problems. We should learn from our victories. We should learn from people's examples. And that's what we have here in the book of Proverbs. We have examples and admonition. In the Bank of Montreal, in Sault Ste. Marie, on the Queen Street branch, there is a mosaic on the wall. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a picture of a voyageur canoe with an Indian and a Frenchman. The Bank of Montreal, after all, was founded by Frenchmen. Right? And it's rather an interesting mosaic. Lots of times when there's long lineups, I'll sit there and look at it. I'm interested in art. And I can imagine the amount of hours that it would have taken some poor fella with a tool of some sort, cutting those little pieces of rock, fitting them in there, planning out what he's going to do. Thousands of pieces of little rocks in that mosaic. And in my mind's eye, marriage and the home is like a mosaic. We can look in our mind's eye at our relationships at home. And there are all kinds of little pieces that together form a picture. And we can look at our marriage and we can see a certain kind of a picture. We can see something that's beautiful or overall pretty bad. Or maybe we can see a pretty good looking picture that's got a whole bunch of wound marks on it. You know, somebody's taken rocks and pitched it at the mosaic and busted it up in places. I think that's what the devil's trying to do today. I think he's trying to take your picture and my picture, and he's throwing rocks at it. He's trying to break out the important little pieces that make up the picture. No picture is completely destroyed by any single rock, by any single missing element. There's all kinds of elements that together make up that entire picture. But maybe, you know, he really busted up a good one in your life just recently. Maybe he's working on some area and he's trying to destroy you, trying to make you think like you're a total failure. Just remember, that's just one area that makes up the entire picture. What I want to do this morning with you in the short time we have is to just kind of breeze through some of the references that Solomon gives to us in the book of Proverbs on marriage, husband-wife relationships in particular, the home. I want to draw two pictures, and I want to put them in stark contrast to one another as extremes, as opposites, on this very important theme. Because I think what Solomon was doing is he was drawing a mosaic. He was a master artist for his son, and he was realizing that people retain more through the eye gate than they do through the ear gate. So what Solomon's doing is he's drawing a great big picture over here, and he's putting the pieces of the puzzle in. You know, this is one element, here's another element, and he's putting them in piecemeal. These are the characteristics of a good marriage. A marriage that is desirable, that is successful, that is fulfilling God's original designs. And then he's going to draw over here another picture, a different mosaic, with an equal number of stones in the mosaic, with different elements. And he's going to show us the other side. And of course, everywhere throughout the book of Proverbs, Solomon is writing from the perspective of a godly man in fellowship with the Lord, trying to encourage his son to, of course, model your life after this picture. Take a good look at the elements of this one and compare it to your own self and say, aha, that's missing. That's missing. I had that once, but the devil knocked that piece out of my picture, and so forth. And that's what I really want to do with you this morning. I want to draw those mosaics, these pictures. I want to encourage you people, as I have been encouraged, to keep working at it. To don't let one missing stone in the mosaic destroy or discourage. To be more patient, to keep working at it day by day. I think one of the first things that needs to be said about marriage, and we'll come back to this hopefully at the conclusion of this message, is that in both pictures there's two people involved. In each picture there's marriage. That means the union of two, in the good and the bad. Right? Let's face it. God says that man shall leave his mother and father, shall join himself to his wife, cleave to her, and they shall become one flesh. Whenever that happens, there's a bond. Now, even if it's destroyed by men, or confused, or whatever, there was always that bond. There was always that union. Right? As long as those parties live, there is that union. Right? Doesn't matter what happens, there was always a union. Right? And what we're seeing here, one of the fundamental things that need to be realized, even good and bad marriages, it's a shared experience. None of us can ever get away from that shared experience, whether it's good or bad. I've asked you to turn to Proverbs 1:8. This is just the first of many illustrations in the book of Proverbs that refers to this. Here in this verse, Solomon is talking about shared responsibility. My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother. And what we have here is a picture of father and mother both teaching. They're both leaving impressions in the impressionable minds of their offspring. Shared. Either for evil or for good. But it's there. And nobody that ever gets married can ever get out of that situation. You always leave an impression. You always teach something by your example. psychologists will tell you that probably one of the most foundational mechanisms in learning and cognition is example, modeling. You see somebody, and the easiest way to learn something is to do what you see somebody else do. Hence the great importance of good homes and of good Christian examples. Now let me speed up a little bit. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 14, verse 11. We're going to turn a number of references this morning. Here's the first element in these two pictures. Proverbs 14:11. Solomon says, "The house of the wicked shall be overthrown, but the tabernacle of the upright shall flourish." In this picture we have rock number one. We have a righteous couple. In this one we have an unrighteous, we have a wicked couple. Now make no mistake. It's so easy for us to read a portion of Scripture and to conclude it has absolutely nothing to do with us. Solomon is putting everybody in his room into the same basket this morning. He's saying you're either in this compartment or you're in this compartment. You are either or, righteous or wicked. Let me ask you this morning. In God's eyes, who is the final arbiter, final judge, who has given the ultimate standards, are you righteous, you and your spouse? Or are you unrighteous? Maybe that's too general for you, so we'll keep going. But I just want you to see that, here it is. Segment number one. There's a spiritual element here. Your home has either got this rock or it's got this rock in it as part of the picture. You're either righteous, and if you're an upright person, God says that picture's going to flower and blossom. In quite sharp contrast to what happens to the wicked. God will tear it down. Chapter 15, verse 6. "In the house of the righteous is much treasure, but in the revenues of the wicked is trouble." Okay, stone number 2 in each picture. Bang, bang. You got it. Right? Still talking about the same kind of people. It's a spiritual quality that the spouses possess here. In this picture, it's an upright, righteous couple. In this picture, it's wicked in God's eyes. As a result, as something that follows, just like night follows day, this quality will bring certain results. And this quality will bring certain results. And they're there. Trouble as a result, much treasure as a result. Let's move on a little bit further. Chapter 15. We're in chapter 15. Verse 17. I'd like to parallel this verse to chapter 17, verse 1. But he says here, "Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred therewith." To me this is a graphic verse because I never did like greens. I still don't like greens. I don't know if I ever will like greens. I can eat them. If I come to your house and you offer me spinach or boiled dandelion leaves or something like that, well, I'll eat it with a smile on my face. But don't turn your head, I might feed it to the dog. But you know what Solomon is saying here? He's actually talking about greens here. It's better to have a little bit. It's better to have a dinner of just green grass, and that's a poor man's diet, than to have a fatted ox and hatred therewith. To me, there's another stone plugged into these two pictures here. Okay, in this house, you've got hatred, but with hatred, you have all the material blessings that the world has to offer. The finest of everything. In this picture, you've got genuine love, even if you don't have much else. Which you'd rather have? Chapter 17, verse 1. Better, Solomon says, literally in the Hebrew, the word better is gooder than. You know, it's a matter of comparison here. Good, gooder, and goodest. That's really horrible English, but it gets the point across. You know, if you're going to put it on a scale, it's gooder to have a dry morsel, leftover bread, and quietness therewith than a house full of sacrifices with strife. You know, someone has said that the average home in North America today is a filling station. People just come and eat, you know, and then they split, you know, travel in and out, slam the car door, take off, bang, gone, over with. No lasting, enduring relationships, no commitment, no togetherness. The filling station usually has an awful expensive inventory. Right? Well, anyways, that's what Solomon is describing here. He said it's better. Plug one into this picture again. It's better to have nothing but leftovers. And ease and peace is literally the Hebrew word. To be at ease. To feel right at home. To be relaxed. Than it is, and plug one into this picture, than to have a house full of sacrifices with strife. Literally in the Hebrew, sacrifices of strife. In other words, you know, picture a home where mom and dad are both working, let's say. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. You can even have one person doing work 24 or 23 3/4 hours a day. You've got all kinds of sacrifice to get. But all it does is produce contention because mom isn't happy, kids aren't happy, dad isn't happy. They're getting things, but they're not getting love. They're not getting satisfaction. You know, this is telling us something. You know, is your house this or that? Take a big checklist this morning and ask yourself, which characteristic best fits my situation? Chapter 21, verse 20. I would like to read verse 19 and 20 together. I'm not sure if they go together, but maybe so. And in case I run out of time this morning, which it looks like I have, I did want to say something about the poor little old lady that gets blamed for all these things in the book of Proverbs. It is better to dwell in the wilderness, Solomon says, than with a contentious and an angry woman. What a multitude of truth in that verse. There is treasure to be desired, he continues, and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man spendeth it up. I think probably many more people are familiar with verse 19 of this chapter than they are verse 20. Verse 19 talks about the woman's problem. And there is no doubt that, and plug one into this picture right over here, you got a contentious woman that doesn't know how to shut her trap, that's always got to say something harsh and critical and hateful. You're going to have a certain kind of a house. Solomon said, hey, it's better to go roost somewhere than to come home to that. That's a very serious problem. But he says over here, there is treasure to be desired and oil in the dwelling of the wise. Plug one into this picture again. Right? Here's another part of the mosaic. You have a couple, spouses that are truly wise spiritually, and they're going to have things that are worth a lot. In contrast, and plug one in here, now this is the man's part, the foolish man spends it all up. It only takes one person to delete a bank account, doesn't it? Just one. Now, Solomon says it's the man's fault here. I suppose it could be turned around. But, well, let's leave it with the man here. This is what Solomon referred to. Somebody that doesn't have any sense doesn't know how to keep money. And we're going to come back to this when we talk about specifically husbands and wives, because Solomon has a great deal to say. Let's go, for instance, to well, I didn't want to leave this first until we go to chapter 24, verses 3 and 4, because this is on the same theme as this last verse. He says in a godly home, in a productive marriage, you're going to have wise people. Well, look at the emphasis here in Proverbs 24, verses 3 and 4. He says, through wisdom is an house builded, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Now 3 times Solomon comes back and pounds his anvil on this theme. And really, when you boil it down to it, when you analyze your home and your relationship, practical decisions and lifestyle, the way we live, is always determined by a certain kind of thinking, a certain kind of philosophy. And therefore, that thinking is either wise or it is unwise. Solomon says that the only way to have a house that is structurally sound in the spiritual sense, to have a house that's going to last the trials of life, is to have true wisdom. That's the way you build a house. And by understanding it's established. There's a difference between building and establishing a house. One is like the groundwork, and the other is the framing, how you continue to build it. And it takes years to build a house. In the space of 4 or 5 years, you can have a passel full of kids. You just built your house. Okay? Now, the next 10 or 20 are going to take establishing. And it takes the same qualities to get that done. It takes wisdom, literally, discernment. And by understanding, by knowledge. All right, I didn't want to overly kill that. But the way we think. Let's face it, that's really what Solomon is, the issue at stake, that makes the real difference between these 2 mosaics, the way a person thinks. Now, I can tell you, Christians I know that have problems in these areas, goes back to the way they think, ultimately. Now let's go to chapter 11, verses 16 and 17, and the next few references that I want to focus in on the wife. Then we will focus in on the husband. Proverbs chapter 11, verses 16 and 17. Solomon says, "A gracious woman retaineth honor, and strong men retain riches." Now, there is something in this verse that I'd never seen before. I always wondered about this verse. I wonder no longer. It's really interesting. First, let's look at the gracious woman part. A gracious woman, literally a woman of grace and elegance. What does such a woman do? What is her motivation? What is it that she is mostly interested in her life? Solomon says, a gracious woman retains honor. That Hebrew word for retain means to grab. She grasps, she seeks to attain. If nothing else, what she really wants is honor. And the next phrase, I think, is a specific commentary on the woman. Because this is a very unusual statement that Solomon makes. Next, he says, and strong men retain riches. His word here is for strong men is literally and very currently translated awesome. Awesome. A man that is just literally awesome, powerful, tough. Somebody that you would be terrified to meet in a dark alley or even on the broad daylight. Says strong men, and he uses exactly the same verb. Retain, grasp after riches. Obviously what he's saying is, just like, and I forgot to say something, this word is never ever used in the Old Testament. This word for awesome men is never used in a good connotation. It's always used in a bad connotation. You're talking about pillagers, rapists, looters for hire, warriors, mercenaries for hire. We're talking about bad dudes here. And you look at their motivation to get what they want and then transfer that motivation to the mind of a woman. And ask yourself, ladies, what is it that I really most try to attain? With the utmost of my energies, what is that I'm mostly motivated to get? Is it honor? Chapter 12, verse 4. On the same theme, Solomon now turns and calls her a virtuous woman. Literally, a woman of ability, a woman of strength, a woman of efficiency. This is what a virtuous woman is. A powerhouse. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. Solomon is saying here that you can plug it into the pictures, whatever it fits. A virtuous woman here is a woman that has ability and energy, and she's strong, and she's motivated. And the word crown means to surround her husband with honor. It's actually translated a garland or a wreath that you'd put on a victor's head. And a virtuous woman isn't just virtuous in opposition or without a husband. She is virtuous in relationship to her husband. Because she's virtuous, she has a husband and she does something for her husband. And there is no such thing as a virtuous married woman who is not a crown to her husband. Solomon puts them as diametric opposites. He says, either you are this kind of a woman that takes your honor that you seek. Remember, chapter 11, verse 16, a gracious woman seeks to grasp and get honor for herself, and then once she's got it, then she seeks to place that honor on her husband as a virtuous woman. You're either that kind of a woman, put that stone into your little picture, or you are a woman that does the exact opposite. Instead of honoring your husband and bringing glory to that man, and people look at him and think that man's lucky. Instead of people having that concept of your husband, you got people feeling so sorry for that man. Because they see you just making him miserable. They see you embarrassing him. They see you making a fool out of that man. And I've seen this. I see it today. I could name names. And God forbid, I'm not a judge, but I got eyes. And Solomon is saying, this is human character. This is qualities that everybody can see. You're either or. And this is where it really comes down to. Ladies, the last chapter in this book is devoted by the compilers to a description of such a woman. And I'm not going to go through this chapter. We don't have time this morning. But I just want to make a kind of a off-the-wall commentary on it here. The chapter begins this way, and really a description of the virtuous woman doesn't begin till halfway through the chapter, in verse 10. Solomon didn't write these words. Some other king did. It's the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. What, my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my vows? Give not strength unto women, nor thy ways to that which destroyeth kings. Verse 10, who can find a virtuous woman? You know who spoke these words? A lady. A lady gave a description of a virtuous woman. We could put all the ladies into one room, and we could give you an assignment to divide the virtuous women from the non-virtuous women. You could probably do a pretty good job. It might be a little hairy. King Lemuel's mom said, son, don't you waste your time on the wrong kind of ladies. Ask yourself a good question. Who can find a virtuous woman? That's not to be interpreted like one of the college boys did a couple of years ago. He interpreted it as if that's impossible. No. This is a very serious question that one young man's mom asked him to ask himself. Who can find a virtuous woman? And the first 2 or 3 verses, the first basic qualification of a virtuous woman is that She has a good relationship to her husband. She honors her husband. The outline to this chapter, if you want it, is a virtuous woman's. We see her fidelity to her husband, and then we see her industry and her labors. There's nothing wrong with working women, as long as they work at home. In fact, there's a lot of women that are at home that aren't working. They don't fit into this category. And then we see her kindness to the poor, and we see her blessedness to her household. And that's what we have here. You look at this, and you don't see some lazy slob lounging around the house, wasting her energies, picking on her old man, cutting down her kids, chewing on them every chance she gets, critical. You see a woman that does her utmost, staying up late at night, and busy for the benefit of her man and her kids. Well, we talked about a woman, and we didn't certainly get through all of what Solomon had to say. He says a prudent wife in chapter 19, verse 14 is of the Lord. Let's talk just a little bit in conclusion about husbands, because somebody's going to get angry if we don't. Chapter 20, verse 6. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 6. I don't know if this is really a commentary on marriage, but I took it that way. Because the next verse talks about a just man walking in his integrity, and his children are blessed after him. So I think maybe verses 6 and 7 go together in the family relationship, the home. Most men, Solomon says, will proclaim every one his goodness, but a faithful man who can find? Well, you ask, who can find a virtuous woman? I ask you, who can find a faithful man? And that's just as serious an issue. Solomon asked that question. Plug them into these pictures again. Over here you've got people that they will not admit, these guys will not admit that there's anything wrong with them. You can't talk to them. They are unapproachable. They cannot take any criticism whatsoever. As far as they're concerned, the only thing they can see in themselves is, hey, you're okay, buddy. Solomon says, literally, a man of many faithfulnesses, who can find? Put him over here. A man of many faithfulnesses. Think about that for a minute. Faithful to his wife, alone. Faithful to his family. Gives them what they need. Not just money. Faithful in the job. Faithful with his time. Faithful with his real affections, concern. Developing an intimate relationship. Faithful in his words, in his attitudes. Faithful in every respect in his life. A man of many faithfulnesses, who can find? That's the real challenge that faces men in the home. Today, our society says, you're okay if you're macho, and if you can make big bucks, you got it made. You're good looking too. You got to have that. Right? You can have all those qualities. A lady can have all those qualities and be a partner in one of the most unsuccessful marriages. As Solomon said, as a jewel of, this one is stuck in my mind. I'm a man, so it's stuck in my mind. As a jewel of gold in a swine's snout, so is a fair woman without discretion. Literally, who has turned aside from discretion. You can have good looks. It does you nothing in a marriage without yielding to discretion. Now, we've only touched on it. We haven't gone through everything that Solomon had to say about marriage this morning. And I see some of you whose stomachs, I can see your eyes, and I can imagine that your stomach is doing what my stomach is doing. So we're going to leave that. But I do want to conclude by just reading some advice that was published in a Yankee newspaper for men. And I leave this with men because men are the heads of the house. God says that it was Adam's fault for sin being in the world, even though his wife really sinned first. He was in charge. God left him. He was the boss, and so the buck stopped with him. Right? Right? Everybody with me here? Okay. I'm not saying that you ladies don't have any responsibility. But anyways, men, Quote, avoid impatience with your wife. She needs to know she has your confidence. What ego is to a man, security is to a woman. Make her feel safe and needed, and she in turn will make you feel 10 feet tall. Be careful what you say to her, for she seldom forgets. Her memory, compared to a man's, is as a cable to a thread. Praise her whenever possible. You will find the appreciation she shows is worth your effort. Being much more sensitive, a woman requires only about 1/4 the criticism you would usually level at your own sex. Allow for her individuality and shower her with constant little deeds of kindness which will show her your continued love and regard. Henry Bosch adds one other rule not mentioned in the above list as stick with her through thick and thin. Henry Ford graduated with his wife from 50 years of successful marriage, and when asked what the formula for their success was, he said it was to stick with the same model. The same thing he did with cars. Now that came from a non-Christian newspaper, but I think it maybe kind of puts everything together that Solomon was talking about, except maybe the spiritual. And of course, humanism wants us to take all man's advice and leave God's out of the picture. Remember these two pictures? There are all kinds of elements. You'll never have this kind of a home without wisdom. Remember, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You got to reverence God. You got to give Him His place in your life. You got to be second, and He's got to be first. And that means pay attention to Him. And Solomon, I think, knew what he was talking about. He had the problem of so many of us that the grass was so green that he kind of turned away from some of the things that he had written. And he paid for it. The next book he wrote was Vanity of Vanities, because he didn't stick with one model, and because he turned away from his own good advice. And he paid for it. His family paid for it. So let's realize the seriousness of this. Let's, number one, encourage the weak and the faint-hearted, right? Let's warn those that are unruly, and let's respect. And for goodness sakes, let's be patient with one another. Right? Let's pray. We come to you, our Father in heaven, thanking you that you are the master example of patience and love. We thank you that you love us enough to chasten us, to turn us around when we're going the wrong direction towards danger. Help us, Lord, to follow your model, to love one another. Help us to pick up from where we are and to realize that in these areas in our relationships where the devil has knocked out the pieces, that you are fully capable of raising us back up and restoring a beautiful picture. But first we must come like David and acknowledge that the only sacrifices that you will accept are a broken heart and a contrite spirit. May we do this, Father, day by day, as we fail you. Cast ourselves upon you. In Jesus' name.